Welcome back to the Describe Your World podcast. Welcome to a brand new series. So, this is the first part in what I hope to be a 10-part series, and tentatively titled Understanding or Getting to Know the God of the Gaps. So, basically, it's this concept that Christianity, or I guess theism, if we're looking at a more broad picture of the belief, is this personal experience where the God of the universe who created everything is a knowable God, and a God who intervenes in our daily lives. And that's kind of the most convincing evidence that I perceive of God. So it's kind of why I was inspired to start a series of this nature. So people I'm talking to are going to have similar experiences, maybe totally different experiences, and I'm excited to see where those conversations go. Or the goal of this series of episodes is just to keep the conversations tight and rich and focused so that there are topics that people are interested in learning about or topics that people are interested in hearing us discuss. My very first guest for this series is a returning guest for Describe Your World, Justin Wiggins. He is an author, a very decorated author, I would say. Correct me if I'm wrong, Justin, but 8 books now, is that correct?
Yes, indeed, my friend. Thank you for your encouraging words.
Of course. I'm going to try to name all of them. And I wrote these down beforehand, so I'm kind of cheating. But Surprised by Agape, Surprised by Myth, Celtic Twilight, Celtic Dawn, Ragnarok, Marty and Irene, Celtic Song, and Tir na Nog.
Yes, indeed. You've named them all.
Very nice. So if you're a listener or a viewer of the podcast, go take a look at those. Maybe Justin will talk a little bit more in depth about some of the pieces as we go through the conversation. But I highly recommend them. I own personally several of these, and I think Justin's a fantastic writer. So you have my endorsement, of course.
Thank you.
So I will let you say a couple words about yourself before we get into this focused discussion.
Great. So I am an author that lives in Black Mountain, North Carolina. I have a really good community here. I love the landscape. I am thankful for the tension and pain and struggle that has allowed me to grow in my faith. I came to believe in Jesus of Nazareth as the Messiah and King through the influence of the musician John Foreman and the writer C.S. Lewis about 16 years ago, and that changed my whole worldview. It was the greatest thing that ever happened to me. And during that period of time, up until now, where I'm at in my life, I've gone through different seasons and experienced tension between doubt and faith, and the doubts have strengthened my faith. Also, during that time, I found my voice as a writer, and through Lewis, I discovered other writers such as Jane Austen, the Bronte sisters, J.R.R. Tolkien, George MacDonald, James Haney, John O'Donohue, W.B. Yeats, and I was able to connect with many different musicians and writers and poets through the influence of Lewis, and go into different Inkling conferences, and also through work and at pubs and coffee shops and through social media writers groups. I've been able to connect with an eclectic community of different artists, and it's made my life very rich. I'm immensely thankful, and I have a great zest for life and the mountains of North Carolina and Ireland and Scotland and England and pubs and coffee shops and bookshops.
Yeah, awesome. I mean, I think our experiences are different enough that we can sort of pull some context out and dive into it. But I think that our experiences are similar enough that having you first in the series makes a lot of sense to me, because I think that your background with faith, sort of that dark night of the soul story or wrestling through belief, is really important and foundational for a lot of believers and people of faith. And I think that our sort of background with church experiences and just how we came to understand Christianity is very similar as well. So it's really cool to start the series together and sort of navigate not only your story and understanding of where faith comes from, but mine as well. And so I guess I kind of want to start with the idea of the inspiration for the series. And for me, it comes from a place of doubt and a place of skepticism, which is interesting because I do profess Christianity and I believe very strongly in Christianity. However, I'm not convinced that a Christian who is extremely strong in his or her faith can be such unless they also have doubts and questions, which is something I think we would agree is sort of one of the tenets of John Foreman's perspective or view. And
Yeah.
we might be able to get deeper into that. But, I went through a period of doubt, and I went through a period of sort of deconstructing my faith, almost all the way down to just your blank slate, and then trying to piece it back together. And I think what I learned about myself is that my faith was totally informed by my childhood and the church that I grew up in and where I came from. And I realized that if I wanted to really believe in something strongly, I had to have a strong sense, a strong definition of it, a strong sense of the arguments against it. And that's kind of the end of the journey where I am now, is that now I'm back to where I started, being a strong proponent of Christianity. So how do you understand your agnosticism and sort of where you came from? Because I think that's a really important piece of the discussion.
Yes. Well, thank you for sharing some of your story and for posing that question. Yes. So I'll begin by answering. I grew up in Southern Free Will Baptist theology, and although I was thankful to be raised in the church and to be taught the theological virtues of faith, hope, and love, and I saw that people in that community in Eastern North Carolina cared about helping the poor and the broken. Like yourself, was very skeptical and inquisitive, and it took me a long time to realize, well, not just a long time, but it took me a few years to realize that I was an agnostic, that I didn't believe in anything divine. And it took quite some time to even be able to have that realization and to be able to even articulate the questions that I had, because in the culture that I grew up in, if you come out as an agnostic, or if you ask theological and philosophical questions, it was unfortunately sort of frowned upon. And it wasn't anything to do with my family, it's just the way that culture was so ingrained with this cultural expression of Christianity and fundamentalism and rapture theology, and didn't know anything about different expressions of Christianity from, Roman Catholicism or the Orthodox Church, Anglicanism, and other expressions of the faith. It was completely foreign to me. And so, uh, listening to Switchfoot's music and really resonating with their honest lyrics, and then discovering John Foreman's solo music was a balm to my soul, because I related to the honest doubts that John was expressing, but also the yearning to know if there was a good and loving God that cared about all of humanity. So, and I finally came to a point where I realized I was an agnostic, and getting to that point was very frightening and healing at the same time. It was frightening in the sense that I didn't know if I would remain an agnostic for the rest of my days. I didn't know if I would be ostracized from the herd, if you will. And also, it was healing because I was able to finally understand, wow, although I've grown up in the church and I've been taught the doctrines of Christianity, I don't believe it. And I don't find it logical. I didn't find it to be, well, at least the version that I came across was presented as a bribe. And I found that really disturbing. And I always was quite contrarian in the sense of not agreeing with a particular worldview just because I was taught it. And I saw also a lot of proselytizing and brainwashing, and then the purity culture stuff. And then, years later, the author of the book, what is it? I Kissed Eddie Goodbye, comes out as an agnostic. And so, things like that eventually come out years later. I saw the seeds of that, if you will. But finally getting to that place of being an agnostic, I wanted to, I continued to ask honest existential questions about pain and suffering, and what about different worldview perspectives? What about the divine? Questions about ethics, metaphysics, and the origin of love and human consciousness and art. And although I found other worldview perspectives interesting and it did explore some of those, I had a gradual conversion to Christianity, and I came to know a person, and that person was the same Jesus of histories as the same Jesus of faith. And C.S. Lewis was really helpful in that journey because I really loved his. I really resonated with his story. You know, he grew up as a in Belfast, Northern Ireland, Irish Protestant, and he eventually became a staunch atheist. And although he asked historical and existential questions, it was this deep yearning that Switchfoot writes a lot about, and John, especially in their song "Restless." And Lewis called this yearning joy, and borrowed the he borrowed the term joy from the German idea of not just an idea, but a universal human experience. And the German word is sehnsucht, and it means yearning and longing. And for Lewis, that yearning and longing he called joy was roused by the beauty of landscape, the power of myth and poetry and story, and the beauty of nature and the power of love. And he came to a place where he rejected logical empiricism as a means for truth. And the friends that he met at Oxford helped him through those hurdles. Owen Barfield, especially, where Barfield basically showed him the fallacy of what he called chronological snobbery. And at the time, the sort of the if it can't be explained in an empirical way, then it isn't true. And Barfield pointed out to Lewis that that was erroneous, because it's all based on finite human knowledge, and science and faith are not mutually exclusive. In fact, science arose from many theistic thinkers, even if they didn't profess um, belief in the Christian God. At least they were a deist or a theist of some type. And then Tolkien did his work well with Lewis by showing him that all the dying and rising God stories in the ancient pagan myths that he loved actually happened in the first century in the historical incarnation, death, and resurrection of Jesus of Nazareth. And then when I read Lewis and read about his story, I resonated with it. And he had a lot of pain in his life also. He lost his mother at a young age. He lost many friends in World War One, and he suffered the trauma of that. So he knew what it meant to experience great suffering and great evil. And in my own life, I dealt with father abandonment struggles and dark seasons of depression, and that caused worldview and identity conflict. And I survived a few unfortunate suicide attempts, and I found healing and hope through all of those experiences. And I found that in my journey, what it came down to, I used my reason, and I wasn't going to check my brain at the door, but I also recognized, reason has its limits, and I embraced faith in Christ. And I found that all the yearning and longing that I had, roused by the power of Celtic music and the mythology of Tolkien and the mythology of, or the mythical works of Tolkien and Lewis, their fantasy works in Celtic and Norse mythology. And I also, like Lewis, I found myself fascinated with that death and resurrection pattern in ancient primitive uh, cultures and religions. And when I came to know Christ, I was not prepared for how the Holy Spirit transformed my brain chemistry, my desires, and like St. Paul says in the New Testament, all things are made new. So it was a divine experience with Christ, and I couldn't rationalize it. I couldn't explain it away. And I saw the limits of logical empiricism, and I finally understood when I came to know Christ that people of whatever worldview have faith, whether they're atheist, agnostic, Buddhist, Hindu, Muslim, Jew, Christian, Unitarian. We all have faith. We have a paradigm that we live by, a narrative with which we live by. And that was such a revelation to me and a comfort to me, because it helped me understand that faith is not a delusion. Whereas before my conversion, I was afraid that it was, because I saw so many uh, evangelicals that I encountered that just believed in Christianity because it's what they're taught. And, everyone has a different journey. And I don't, find any people at fault with that. And that's great if that's someone's journey. But for me, it was not that way. And I just could not embrace a worldview just because I was taught it. So I'm glad I'm thankful for the the questions and the doubts and even the tension and the pain. The dark night of the soul is a dark night of the soul, and that was a really dark season. But out of that dark season came a resurrected faith, a renewed passion for life and for community, and I grew in my faith. And since then, like yourself, I've had seasons of doubt, and I have always found that those doubts have strengthened my faith in Christ. And I would go back and reread books by Lewis and MacDonald and Tolkien, and I'm discovering other Irish writers like Seamus, or other, not just Irish writers like Seamus Heaney and John O'Donoghue, but other writers out there like Neil Gaiman, who even evokes the transcendent or the numinous in his uh, books. And I think he identifies as an agnostic. I'm not quite sure. But I have found that these writers, even if they don't have the same worldview as I do, they still explore what it means to be human. And many of them evoke that sense of that sehnsucht, mystical joy. And like you're saying, that can be experienced in daily life. And for me, that pointed to the great bard Christ, if you will, that can be known and that is making all things new right here and right now through acts of justice and kindness and love and the power of art and community and through the sacraments. And that is incredibly encouraging to me. So I would say that is, for me, the existential evidence of the agape love of Christ experienced in daily life in many of those different ways.
Of course. I mean, I think there's a lot to unpack, and I think that we'll hit several of the kind of the points that stood out to me, I guess. But I do think your experience is not totally unique. I think that a lot of people who sort of make the journey of uncovering God in day-to-day life have a really similar experience. I mean, I definitely can say for
Yeah.
myself that my journey is similar in a lot of ways. I think that it's important to sort of point out that agnosticism is really dealing with like knowledge, and I think that atheism is more so dealing with like belief. So
Yeah.
agnosticism in particular is really interesting to me because you can be agnostic and still allow room for God to exist. It's sort of more like I don't know. That's sort of
Yeah.
your stance, is that sure there's some existential evidence for, and there's some scientific evidence maybe against, but at the end of the day just don't have enough knowledge to profess like 100% that there's a deity or a higher power. I wanted to bring
Mhm.
up one idea that I thought you might find really interesting. And this is,
Yeah.
I don't know if you've heard of this before, but this comes from Richard Dawkins, who is, interestingly enough, I believe, atheist or agnostic. I'm pretty sure atheist. And
Yeah.
his theory is the spectrum of theistic probability. So it kind of works like there are 7 different spaces that you can exist in as a believer or non-believer. If you're number 1, you're a strong theist. So you're 100% certain beyond a shadow of a doubt that God is real.
Mhm.
And if you are like a 7, you're 100% certain beyond a shadow of a doubt that God is not real. And so you sort of fall on that spectrum somewhere, where
Mhm.
agnosticism itself is like number 5. It's like leaning toward just lacking the knowledge and being unsure, but sort of being a de facto atheist that, just based on what science can dictate or show us, that there is no God. But again, you're just lacking sort of crucial information and you can't piece it all together. And Dawkins himself would actually say that he's not actually a 7. He sort of falls somewhere between 6 and 7. So even though he is sort of led by science to believe there is no God, he can't be 100% certain, and he's not willing to state with certainty that there is none.
Mm.
Interestingly enough, this spectrum of theistic probability, if you ask a theist or a Christian more specifically where they fall in that spectrum, most of the time they're going to say a 1. So if you're someone like us who've had that experience of knowing a personable God, there's this 100% certainty that he's there and that he is knowable. And I wanted to get your thoughts on that because I thought that was really interesting that, agnosticism and atheists, they sort of land somewhere that's not certain, but they kind of land on the spectrum, whereas theists, i.e. Christians, sort of land with that certainty.
Yeah, that is interesting. First, I'd like to say I'm certainly aware of Richard Dawkins and his arguments, and Sam Harris and the late Christopher Hitchens. I never found Dawkins' arguments convincing. He raises important questions, and he always struck me, unfortunately, as an asshole. And if someone is going to be a deliberate asshole, I don't really have much respect because it begins by begging the question if you're already assuming that people believe in the divine or that have a spiritual religious worldview that are much smarter than you are deluded. That to me is silly and childish. Uh, and in fact, I really found the debates that he had, Dawkins, the debates that Dawkins had with the Irish professor of mathematics at Oxford, who's I think retired now. He's still living, but quite on in age. John Lennox, and John Lennox really did a good job of refuting his many of his fallacies, and with wit and with great humor. And I think that they're friends, if I'm not mistaken. And also Hitchens debated Lennox, and even Hitchens conceded that Lennox won. And of course, Lennox wasn't debating them just to simply try to win, but he cares about the power of ideas, and he cares about honest philosophical inquiry and where that leads. And as you and I are, he's very passionate about his faith in Christ as well as being a brilliant mathematician. So yeah, the Dawkins theistic probability theory that you mentioned is really interesting, and how people find themselves on that different spectrum is really interesting. And yes, and you're right in pointing out the distinction between atheism and agnosticism. For example, if I had been an atheist, certainly would not have been open to the divine. And I've encountered some very warm, friendly atheists who are not assholes and who are very friendly and cordial. And I've had some very good dialogues with really sincere, respectful, witty atheists, and I've really enjoyed having dialogues with them, and also agnostics. And I will say, when I was an agnostic, I was still open to the divine. Part of me was afraid that it was true, because if it was, I would be wrong, and human beings don't like to be told they're wrong or to be proven wrong or to admit that they're wrong. But part of me was a bit frightened, but also part of me was excited at the same time, because I thought, well, if there is a God, or if there are many gods, or if there's some kind of force or something divine, that is incredibly exciting to me, because it would give my life meaning and purpose, and I want to see where these questions will lead. I didn't want to simply stay an agnostic, and that was also a very confusing time, and I yearned to know, and it was really something that I was passionate about, finding answers to those really intense questions. So yeah, I'm glad that I still stayed open to the divine. But as you said, it's that distinction is important, and I suppose different atheists would perhaps be open to the divine, and some would not. So that's also interesting to take into consideration. But yeah, that distinction you made between the two is really interesting, as well as the theistic spectrum that you were given a context on.
Well, this is important too, and I think it's something that I kind of had in mind as sort of the thesis for our discussion, but it ended up kind of getting tossed in the wind, which is totally fine. We can always circle back around to things, but it sort of ties into what we're hitting at here, which is interestingly, a lot of the people I've talked to that are atheist, or a lot of the people that I've listened to or watched that are atheist, the one that comes to
Mm.
mind is Alex O'Connor. I don't know if you're extremely familiar with his sort of reasoning and thought, but a lot of the
Yeah,
time
he's brilliant.
he
Mm.
often says like, I'm one conversation away from converting because I'm looking for that overwhelming, convincing argument that sort of turns my belief. Um,
Mm.
and he's like ex-Catholic, so he grew up in church and he prayed and he kind of went through all of the spiritual, I guess, regimen of training and upbringing and gathering knowledge already. But it seems to be sort of a common thing that people who are atheistic are looking for that excuse to sort of turn to Christianity. Not all of them, of course, but some of them. And
Mm.
I think it's sort of because we have this, what you were talking about with this feeling of not being comfortable as a part of this world. You know, we have this longing and this yearning for something greater. And as a result of that, what we would like for the answer to be is that God and heaven are real and accessible. So our inclination may be more so to believe, but our rational brains and empirical concepts just sort of restrict and limit those people from believing. Or maybe it's something different. Maybe it's some sort of like moral relativism, or some issue with evil, or some issue with suffering, as a lot of people experience. Um,
Mm.
Fascinatingly enough, I don't know if it's accurate as of today, but recent studies suggest that about 7 to 9% of the Earth's population identifies as like atheistic, or not believing in any higher power or deity at all.
Mm.
Um, and that's between 400 and 500 million people. 200 million of those people live in China. And as
Mm.
we know, China is pretty big on separation of church and state. So it's almost like, whether or not you'd like to believe, you really can't, because, religion is sort of a threat to the political system that exists. Therefore, we want to limit religion as much as possible. And in doing so, we will restrict religious freedom if we have to, kind of thing. So I
Mm.
think it's fascinating to me that, out of the 4 to 500 million that there are, essentially, that identify outright atheism, I can sort of excuse away like 200 million of those pretty easily as just sort of a political affront or a push or an assertion. So it's a minority. It's a small group that believe in absolutely nothing beyond this life. So
Mm.
I think those are two sort of convincing points for me in my faith, that number one, there's this kind of inclination or desire to know this personable God and ultimately
Mm.
experience paradise. And then also that there's such a small group of people who ultimately choose not to believe, or maybe are compelled not to believe if that's the situation.
That is interesting, and I have watched some of Alex O'Connor's conversations that he has had with different people like William Lane, not, with different people like William Lane Craig and Bart Ehrman. I would love for him to have one with N.T. Wright, because you probably are aware of this. N.T. Wright and Bart Ehrman are disagree strongly, but at least Bart Ehrman concedes that Jesus of Nazareth actually did live, and he was an eccentric first century rabbi, but he
Mhm.
disagrees with the claim of his divinity and his resurrection narrative, whereas N.T. Wright affirms both. Yeah, I have really enjoyed Alex O'Connor's conversations. Very brilliant. I would feel quite intimidated in conversation with him, but I think I could hold my own with him. You know, if he posed questions to me about why I believe what I believe, I would respond with why I believe Jesus of Nazareth is the same Jesus as faith and history, and bring in my personal journey, so that the existential evidence, if you will, um, of being transformed by the agape love of Christ. And yeah, that is interesting, and that um, dynamic that it goes on in China is really interesting, isn't it? Because that although in China it's mostly you gave the statistics. Most people, I suppose, are skeptics there, if I'm not mistaken, and the political power there is very against uh, spirituality, which is interesting because China's roots are in Buddhism.
Hmm.
So that's quite a contrast, isn't it? And the interesting thing about when people in power who use a political ideology to control people's religious freedom, they can try as much as they like, and of course history has shown terrible things have happened, but that yearning and desire for the divine never goes away. It will never be stamped out. And isn't that interesting that in even places like North Korea, for, for God's sake, people there are seeking hope and healing, and many people that are able to escape and that will go to South Korea and immigrate to different parts of the world, they don't stop. They don't allow the terror of that totalitarian crackpot regime obliterate their desire to experience hope and healing. And that, to me, it speaks volumes about the desire human beings have for the divine. And that's incredible that when people are in a cultural crisis situation, whatever the context, that they don't seem to be defeated. They might experience great suffering, but they experience redemption. They see not just see, but they experience redemption in that suffering. Like someone like Corey Ten Boom would be an example of that, who saved so many Jewish people during the Holocaust, and goodness only knows how many doubts and she had, and how much suffering she went through, but she still saw the goodness of God on display in daily life in the midst of such a terrible world crisis that was going on. Isn't that amazing when someone can still believe in the goodness and love of the Creator in the face of so much horrendous suffering and tension and struggle? Yeah, I really admire someone who has a depth of faith like that.
Yeah, I think it's extremely telling, and there's this perplexing dichotomy between, I guess, religion or faith and science, because it can
Mm,
almost, depending on the way the wind blows, it can almost shift either way depending on your perspective. So, for example, um, for the atheistic scientist, it may be that you can explain away this desire to have a personal relationship with God, because obviously we as human beings understand our mortality and we understand death and suffering. So we
mm,
need to, as sort of the title of the series insists, that they fill in the gap with a God, because how else can we explain the cruelty of this life and the suffering in this life unless there's some
mm,
kind of reward after the life, right? And
mm,
if there is no reward and if there is no God, then it's just cruel and insufferable and miserable. So
mm,
it's very interesting. And then obviously on our side of the coin, on our perspective, it's the exact opposite. It's that the cruelty and misery and suffering of this life point to a personal God who loves us infinitely and who took it upon himself to step into history and make a way for us to sort of step over that threshold out of suffering and out of our bondage into peace and harmony and grace. And so
mm,
it's so strange to me, and it really perplexes me that you have two people who are essentially looking at the same concept, right? This story of grace and sacrifice and infinite love, and you get two totally opposite conclusions.
Yeah. Yeah. Those are really important issues you bring up. I remember before my conversion, I almost came to that view that the divine was a human fabrication because we feared death and we needed a pie in the sky, happy ending that would get us through this life. And then when I finally understood that it's not wishful thinking to desire to know a good and loving creator, and I think it takes a great deal of courage, in fact, to embrace faith in a good and loving creator in the reality of suffering and evil. And you made an important distinction there with the two views. And I found on my journey that I was not going to embrace a delusionary worldview, and I didn't want to live with that. I didn't want to just blindly accept any worldview. And I found that the not just Christians, but other religious or spiritual people that did believe in an afterlife, they allowed their faith right here and right now to do great good in the world, and they weren't sitting around doing nothing. And I really admire great thinkers who, not just great thinkers, but everyday people even now who embody that and who believe in the reality of God's redemption that can be experienced right here and now, in contrast to the loss and pain that they have experienced in their life. A good example to me of an incredible human being who embraced that was George MacDonald. He was an incredible Scottish writer and preacher and writer of myths and fairy tales, and he suffered greatly in his life. He lost many of his children to tuberculosis, which I couldn't imagine going through something like that. He had really difficult issues with his lungs, and he also suffered great persecution by the arrogant fundamentalism of his day that had the view that if you were poor, you were doing something wrong, and if you were wealthy, you were following God's will. And he also rejected what he saw as the false either or of Calvinism and Arminianism, and he had some really fascinating theological views. And I've read most of his works, not all of them, but in his fiction and nonfiction and poetry, he conveys the great suffering and pain he went through, and that suffering is a mystery, and you can't rationalize it. And in the Christian faith journey, there is room for doubt. There's room for anger towards God. There's room for questioning God. And in his journey, that anger and sometimes bitterness and doubt, it all strengthened his faith in Christ, because he found that in the suffering that Christ was with him, and it brought growth in his life and joy, and he saw redemption in it. He never had any explanation for why those terrible things happen, or some shallow platitude like everything happens for a reason that gets thrown around a lot as a common platitude that really is not true, as I have found. And I really admire MacDonald's faith. He had such an incredible sacramental view, which meant that he saw every good thing in this life as a gift of grace. And he was married for over 50 years. He was a great husband and father. He was a brilliant writer and translator, and he knew a few different languages, and inspired C.S. Lewis and Tolkien and Madeleine L'Engle, Frederick Buechner, and suffered great poverty at times in his life as well, which is not pleasant. And he still believed in a good and loving creator, and he was a strong Scotsman, and he had no tolerance or any patience towards any form of wishful thinking or a delusion. He saw that harmony between faith and reason, and I have found great encouragement and great spiritual nourishment in MacDonald's writings and the literary legacy he left behind. To me, he's a great example of someone who who had those same struggles of always the desire for a paradise and to know a good and loving creator, wishful thinking, or rather, is it a legitimate desire that makes a difference right here and right now? And yes, there is the promise of the afterlife, but what makes the joy of the afterlife so beautiful and so worth it is that it's being in the presence of Christ. It's not playing on a cloud and in a harp and all this sort of thing, And it's new creation, and it's being part of this incredible journey that makes a difference right here and right now. Like N.T. Wright, he coined the term "new creation," and he's saying that the creator of time and space is redeeming humanity, and what the biblical vision that you get in throughout. However, many theologians and philosophers and people and within Christendom interpret the scriptures in many different ways. But N.T. Wright has been really helpful to me in how he shows that the biblical narrative is all about, of course, the incarnation, death, and resurrection of Jesus of Nazareth and the marriage of heaven and earth. And we get glimpses of that here and now in this fallen, broken, hurting world, and that this is still God's good world in it. And we're not, the sort of, I remember one of those ridiculous statements I heard growing up that this world is going to hell in a handbasket. And I always found that really disturbing. And Wright has critiqued that sort of, the dispensational rapture theology, which is like, we can't wait to escape the world and go to this pie in the sky place. And I think that form of escapism can be very dangerous. I understand the yearning for especially for someone who's experienced great suffering and whatever that might be, for an eternal paradise. I understand that desire, and there's a legitimate reason for that in the context of someone's story, but we all have a different story. But yes, I love how N.T. Wright is. He's written very eloquently, and not just written about it, but he's really lived it out. He's helped a lot of the poor and the broken, and he is an incredible Anglican priest and a bishop in the Church of England, and he's helped many people recover from toxic fundamentalist theology and really negative forms of Christianity that have been portrayed as a bribe. And he, as you would agree with this, that like in the what he writes about correlates to Switchfoot's theme in their song "Where I Belong." That we're yearning for all to be made right, but while we're still here on the planet, this life is such a gift, and things like love and community and work and rest and music and literature and art and laughter and nature, these are all good sacramental things, and we should embrace them and rejoice in them. And in those experiences, as I can say from personal experience, they give me a glimpse of the marriage of heaven and earth when all will be set right. And to me, that's incredibly exciting, and it gives my life great meaning right here and right now. So to me, that's certainly the opposite of wishful thinking and wish fulfillment,
Yeah, it's something that sort of speaks to me, I guess, is this and it kind of ties in, but it's this idea that all of these different religions sort of not necessarily peacefully coincide, but they all sort of exist. And for example, India's example of a country in which like 99% of its population are believers in some higher power,
Yeah.
which is, it might be the highest percentage of any country in the world, just because it's, almost unanimous. It's almost across the board. And
Yeah.
obviously the United States is like maybe like 65% belief in some kind of higher power. They don't always necessarily believe in a heaven. Sometimes they
Mm.
believe in a reincarnating factor where we get to live this life to the best of our ability and then we get another shot, and so forth and so on. Sometimes they
Yeah.
believe, as Christianity does, that there is an existence that goes on with God for eternity afterward, as long as you're saved. And
Mm.
then there are religions that don't have necessarily a God that is personal at all. Like, you could be a deist and believe that God was an actor in the creation of the universe and then just kind of was like pieced out and just left us here. So,
Mm.
but there are all these different sort of interpretations of how we come to know God and how we understand our origins, and where it all comes from. And for me, the biggest question, the one that maybe I care about the most, is why, right? And that's one thing that
Mm.
I don't think science tackles very well. It's like, in science, there may not be a why. In science, from the atheistic perspective, there may just be randomness, that we're here and we're alive, and one day we won't be, and there's not a reason why. And I think
Yeah.
this species, the human race, is a species that sort of seeks and searches for purpose, right? And I can't remember which debater or philosopher said this, but it stuck with me, that why would we want purpose so much? Why would we have this deep yearning for purpose if we were made out of purposelessness? Like, if there's no
Yeah.
purpose to us, like we were sort of just created randomly out of nothingness, and then we just evolved and mutated into what we are, and that's the explanation of diversity of life, then why do we want purpose so badly? Um,
Mm.
I also think that it's extremely convincing that for a non-believer, if you want purpose, you have to create it. You have to come up with your
Mm.
own purpose. You have to decide for yourself what your calling in life is and what you're going to do with this limited experience on earth. And I just find that to be extremely unsatisfactory. Like, in my
Mm.
mind, I think all of our man-made purposes and all of our individualistic purposes kind of just a wash.
Mm.
I'm not convinced by that at all. So I am curious, as far as your story and your experience, whenever you were going through that period of agnosticism and sort of sifting through the different religious options, the different religions of the world, why is it that Christianity really kind of, I guess, from all intents and purposes, God reached down and pulled you out himself, and, you sort of came to
Mm.
know God personally. So why that one versus all of the other options, I guess?
That is a very good question, and well, I appreciate you posing it and sharing those really important things and some of your story. And when I was going through it, I explored Hinduism. I found the beliefs about Krishna, and uh, I read some of the Hindu Vedas, and with Islam, I read some of the Quran. And Buddhism, that to me was really fascinating. Well, I suppose
Mhm.
depending on which sect of Buddhism, it's really there is no uh, dealing with sin, and suffering is sort of an illusion, and you have to distinguish desire. But it is really interesting, and the Buddhist view of compassion is very wonderful, I think. And I was also attracted to ancient Earth religions. But they're very primitive, and especially the Celtic and the Norse were fascinating to me. They had their different gods of the trees and rivers and war and love and fate. And um, when it came down to it, it wasn't which one religion was right among the many, because I found that very arrogant and sort of triumphalist. And uh, if I had that approach, it would have been sort of the kind of fundamentalist, oh, I'm going to fly my flag, and I'm going to tell you all how uh, wrong you are. Of course, there is a time and place for conveying why you disagree with someone's worldview and why you think they're wrong. that is that has a place, and that can be a healthy debate and a healthy dialogue. But when it came down to it, I found that those death and resurrection patterns and those old dying and rising God stories, where did they come true in time and space? And Lewis and Tolkien wrote about something they called the true myth, and it was something completely foreign to me. And whereas before I was of the mindset, oh well, perhaps one of these religions is right, perhaps they are all right. I don't know. It was very overwhelming. There's so many different worldview perspectives and also different sects within those worldviews. So it was
Of course.
it was very, very confusing, but fascinating because um, I saw religion as in different spiritual paths in attempt to try to find meaning and purpose, and also to answer the most personal questions. And so when I encountered, especially Lewis's Surprised by Joy, and he wrote about that there really was no historical evidence that, Osiris from Egyptian mythology, the one that dies and rises again, or Balder from Norse mythology that dies and rises again, that they existed. But he still saw the authentic desire in those ancient earth religions, and those patterns to him were no mistake, and that fact that those deities didn't exist in a historical sense like Jesus of Nazareth did is not a derogatory way of viewing those ancient religions, but more so that it was a preparation for what was going to happen. And I found his um, writings not just in Surprised by Joy, but in Mere Christianity and Miracles, The Problem of Pain, and some of his other essays. And also in his fiction and fairy tales, where he brings that yearning and longing in, and it's over every page, that this dying and rising God pattern, these all these ancient, fascinating pagan stories about the dying and rising God, it came true in the story of Christ. And I remember encountering that for the first time, and I thought, that is amazing. I've never encountered anyone who has come to embrace faith in Christ in such a way. And um, so I found his journey very fascinating, and I found his writing about the true myth to be very beautiful and fascinating and profoundly moving, and also convincing. I found, whereas before I thought that Jesus of Nazareth, he might have been a fabrication. I don't know if it was, there's their historical evidence. And then when I uh, looked into it, you've got all the different pagan, Roman, and Jewish historians that wrote about Jesus of Nazareth outside of the Bible. And I thought, well, that's really interesting. And, I thought, and the evidence for his resurrection in the first century. An example from the first 4th century Gospels is you got Mary Magdalene, Joanna, and uh, Jesus's mother, all witnesses of the resurrected Christ, and that claim in the first century from a woman's perspective was quite a shock. And N.T. Wright was really helpful on that, and writing about how revolutionary that was for a first century document, and all those. And you got different lenses with which the gospel writers write with, um, and they're all taken from Jewish oral storytelling tradition. So that was really helpful. And so all you got the historical evidence, and all that was helpful. But when it came down to it, I found the true myth was fulfilled in the incarnation and death and resurrection of Christ. And when I came to a place of surrender where I did repent, and I experienced redemption from sin, and I was able to come to that place of surrender and embrace faith in Christ. And I found uh, that this was the creator that I yearned to know and that I came to love. And that was the greatest thing that ever happened to me. And that's my own journey in my first book. Yeah. And so, yeah, your question is a very important one. And in my first book, Surprised by Agape, I wrote it in such a way that it wasn't a work of Christian apologetics. It wasn't nothing against those. I know those have their place, and Lewis was a really good apologist. But it was my own journey of why I came to embrace faith in Christ and why and what that journey was like. And I wasn't trying to convince people of different worldview perspectives to come to know Christ. I was just sharing my story and why I found Christianity to be true. And on that journey, the healing power of music and literature and art played a big role. And there were other reasons I wrote the book, for suicide prevention and to share with people how I went through that furnace of that and how I found a resurrected faith and the role that community and the power of music and literature and art played on that. And it's a life affirming book, and it's my own personal story. And so, yeah, in short, the way that to answer your question, I've given you personal examples from personal experience and how Tolkien and Lewis were really influential in bringing me to that and seeing Christianity as the true myth. And that was so exciting because from that perspective, faith became an epic journey filled with doubt and peril, but also great beauty and love and joy. And it's been really incredible, as I'm sure you probably relate to this, sharing that journey with people of different worldview perspectives, whether it's at work or at the coffee shop or pub or bookshop or a friend of a friend. It's been really moving to learn from a different worldview perspective from someone who doesn't, maybe they relate in the sense that they've posed those same questions, but those questions that they posed didn't lead them to Christianity or to belief in Christ. And I've learned a lot from someone's own unique journey. It's been really meaningful. And in my writings, I try to write in a universal way. And that way, I'm honest about my doubt and honest about my faith in Christ, but also my books are for people of all worldviews. And really, at the heart of the books is the power of music and literature and art. And to me, that never gets old. And I love, as you can not only relate to, but John Foreman and the guys in Switchfoot are big on the emphasis of not writing cheesy, quote unquote Christian music filled with repetitive lyrics and platitudes that don't correlate to life, but songs about death and hope and love and friendship and the joy of being alive and love. And they don't have that sacred secular either or in their approach. And so in my writing journey and in my faith journey, John Foreman's universal approach in his art and his the way he reflects the agape love of Christ in his life has been so healing to me. And I have found that many people respect that, and many people not just respect it, but it's caused me to have some really wonderful friendships. And that way people knew that I wasn't trying to get brownie points to convert them or be clever and proselytize. That's just not me. I
Of
can
course.
identify with that. And it's been a really rich experience. And even my journey of faith, I've learned a lot from different worldview perspectives. And I hope that those examples from my journey in encountering Christianity as the true myth that did happen was a good answer to your really important question.
Well, what I was going to say is, I think if William Lane Craig could listen to this recording, I think he would pat you on the back because his big thing that he always sort of pushes forward in his debates and talks and discussions is sort of those 5 points of the historical Christ. Because as
Yeah,
I said at sort of the top of the recording, sometimes the scientific, the cosmological evidence, the philosophical stuff, sometimes it lacks satisfaction for me when it comes to like concrete God stuff. For me, it's that
yeah,
personal experience of knowing Christ,
same.
and you can't personally know Christ if Christ didn't resurrect. So I think
Yeah,
that the way you frame it and the experience you had, which I think is probably similar to a lot of people who transition from agnosticism to Christianity, would really
mm,
reflect kind of Craig's point of, let's talk about the historical Christ and let's talk about the resurrected Christ first. And then once we sort of confirm that resurrection is, like you say, the true myth, then we can get into
mm,
sort of the cosmological stuff and the philosophical stuff, like like suffering and evil and those kinds of questions. But I
mm,
think he would be extremely proud of that breakdown of where Christ kind of comes into play and the evidence we have. Um,
mm,
so I'll kind of end with this, and you can respond to that if you like as well. But my question is this: so for people who maybe are agnostic now, or atheist, for people who are really straddling the fence and don't have that experience, like maybe they want to be
mm,
Christian, but they haven't had the experience of knowing Christ or personally, or the experience of God calling out to them or influencing their life in some way. But maybe they're reading their Bible, they're going to church, they're seeking and pursuing, and just haven't felt those
mm.
same emotions and feelings. What would you say to someone in that position, and how would you encourage them? And after that, you can also shout yourself out in any way you'd like, and then we will wrap up.
Great. I would encourage them to continue to ask important questions, to keep searching. That was how I eventually embraced faith in Christ. And you made a very good point that everyone has a different journey. And I would also encourage them to find uh, friends in their area that they can have really good conversations like this, with genuine people who aren't going to throw out a Bible verse or give them some shallow platitude, but that will really listen and that will create a sense of uh, genuine connection and find uh, kindred spirits in different musicians and poets. One poet that I would highly recommend reading, John O'Donohue, a really incredible Irish poet and philosopher. He has grew up quite poor in County Clare in Ireland, and he really knew what he was talking about. In his writings, he writes about the confusion and struggles in our that many people have in our technological us versus them polarized world, and how the power of music and literature and art and film, and he brings in Celtic spirituality as well. That has been really meaningful to me on my journey, and I've encountered a lot of people who have similar worldview perspectives than myself and different worldview perspectives that have found his writings to be very good. So I recommend anything by him, and also John Foreman solo music. I've recommended his solo music to many people, and they have found him to be very creative and encouraging and inspiring. So that's what I would say to people that are uh, atheist or agnostic and that are haven't had uh, an encounter with Christ and that would like to believe but perhaps don't see enough evidence or just have uh, existential reasonable reasons why they can't embrace Christianity. And I completely understand that because I was there myself once, and I really respect people that are honestly pursuing meaning and purpose. And uh, as a last thing I'll say, I'm really thankful for the recent response of my book Celtic Dawn, published by Steve Calt of Inspired, and thanks to Carrie Stout, who did the cover art for the Celtic goddess Bridget and a Tirnanog on the background, and the endorsement from my Irish poet friend Gerald White. It was published in July, and it's had a few positive reviews on Amazon and Goodreads, and I'm really thankful. And I've had other recent publications and poetry anthologies, and working on 2 new books coming out next year. And so I've been incredibly encouraged by all the positive response and feedback. And I'm immensely thankful for all the people in my life, all the people that I encounter. I continue to be surprised by the agape love of the great bard Christ. And thank you for having me on your show. And if anyone is interested in checking out my books, they can find my writer's page. They just Google Justin Wiggins, Clarendon House Publications, and also have an author's page on Amazon. And they can find me on Instagram and Facebook, and I'm sure you'll provide links. Thank you for having me on your show, Travis. I appreciate it.
Yeah, awesome. And before we wrap, again, highly recommend Justin's works. Like I said, I personally own multiple books, and they're very inspiring. They're deep, they're real, they're honest, which is, as he mentioned, something that we sort of look for instead of the cookie cutter, comfortable, kind of mushy stuff, which it can be good. It can be really encouraging as far as like a Christian walk, but kind of trudging through the dirt and dealing with the dark night of the soul is maybe more helpful in a lot of ways, especially for people who may be in that place of agnosticism or atheism. So thank you for coming on and having the conversation. I think it was an excellent conversation. And for those who are listening or watching, if you enjoyed it, click the like button, click a follow button if there is one, and stay tuned for part 2, where we kind of continue diving deep into this reconstruction of faith and how faith gets pieced together and why it makes a lot of sense. So appreciate everyone, and we will see you next time.
Indeed. Cheers.